close your eyes and let the world grow still. Somewhere beyond the slow drift of your breathing, there is an empire, the largest empire on earth in the 16th century, so vast that its shadow stretched from the Danube River in the west to the Tigris in the east, from the cold shores of Crimea in the north to the burning sands of Arabia in the south. At the center of this world sat a city, Istanbul, a city of minarets and marble, of silk and smoke, of whispered prayers and whispered conspiracies. And at the center of that city rose Topkapi Palace, the seat of Sultan Suleiman I, a man history would call the Magnificent. For centuries the Ottoman sultans had ruled alone, advised by men, succeeded by the sons of nameless concubines, kept far from the machinery of power. A slave woman was a body, a comfort, never a mind, never a partner, never. A queen. And then she arrived. Her buildings still stand today. In Istanbul, in Mecca, in Jerusalem. A mosque complex bearing her name, the Haseki Sultan Complex, commissioned in 1539, built by the greatest architect the Ottoman world ever produced. Soup kitchens feeding hundreds of the city's poorest every single day. A hospital for women. A caravanserai in Jerusalem. These are the works of a head of state, and she built them all from inside a harem. She wrote letters, personal, politically astute letters in Ottoman Turkish and Italian, to Sigismund II, the King of Poland, to Shah Tahmasp of Persia, letters that shaped diplomatic relationships between empires. No woman in over 200 years of Ottoman rule had done this before. She was the first. She was born in a quiet Ruthenian town called Rohatyn, the daughter of an Orthodox Christian priest. She was perhaps 15 when the Tatar raiders came, when the smoke rose above her village, when everything she had ever known ended. She arrived in Istanbul as cargo, an unnamed slave girl among hundreds. She entered the imperial harem with nothing, no family, no language, no name. By name, she left it decades later as the legal wife of the most powerful ruler on earth, freed from slavery by royal decree, celebrated with a wedding that shattered every precedent the Ottoman court had held for 2 centuries. Her name in the harem was Hurrem. It means the cheerful one. This is her story, and you have all night to hear it. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. Her name, before the world took everything from her, was Alexandra. Some say Anastasia. The records do not agree, and perhaps that is fitting because the world she was born into did not believe such a girl would ever need to be remembered. She came into the world in the early 1500s, in a small, quiet town called Rohatyn, nestled in the rolling green hills of Ruthenia, a land that today we might call Western Ukraine. It was a place of wooden churches and muddy roads, of birch forests and cold rivers, of bread baked in outdoor ovens and prayers spoken in the old Slavic tongue. Her father was an Orthodox Christian priest, a man of God, a man of modest standing but deep learning. He would have read scripture aloud by candlelight. He would have known the old stories of saints and suffering, of endurance, of the soul persisting beyond what the body could bear. Perhaps some part of that knowing passed into his daughter before she could understand it. Perhaps it was the first gift he gave her, and the only one she was allowed to keep. We do not know the precise shape of her childhood. History did not bother to write it down, but we can imagine it because we know the world she inhabited. A small-town childhood in the orthodox borderlands of the early 16th century would have meant embroidered linens and the smell of beeswax candles. It would have meant learning prayers by repetition, learning the rhythms of fasting and feasting, learning to grind grain and to preserve what winter would otherwise take. It would have meant a community, neighbors, a language, a faith, a name, all the invisible structures that tell a person who they are and where they belong. She was perhaps 15 years old. When all of it ended, the Crimean Tatars were not strangers to the borderlands of Ruthenia. They came regularly, seasonally, almost like a dark harvest. The Khanate of Crimea had long made raiding the Slavic territories to its north a cornerstone of its economy. Not war in the formal sense, not conquest or territorial ambition, simply the taking of people, the collection of human beings as a crop. They would ride fast and hard, appear without warning in the gray hours before dawn, and be gone again before any organized resistance could form. The raid that struck Rohatyn, we do not know exactly when it came. Scholars have suggested the early 1520s. Alexandra would have been a young woman, not yet settled into the life that had been quietly arranged around her. What we know is what always happened in such raids. The thunder of hooves on frozen ground or summer dry earth, the sound arriving before the riders themselves. Then the riders, dozens of them moving in coordinated arcs through the village, torches in hand, screaming, the crash of doors, the smell of smoke, animals fleeing, men cut down if they resisted, women and children gathered, bound, pulled from their homes with a speed and efficiency born of long practice. There would have been no time to understand what was happening. There would have been no time for anything except the raw animal terror of the moment. The girl who had woken that morning with a name, with a father, with a language, with a faith, with a whole invisible country of belonging, woke in the afternoon with nothing. Nothing except her own body and whatever she carried inside it. She was bound and marched, along with dozens, perhaps hundreds of others taken from nearby villages on the same sweep. The Slavic peoples called this road the Trail of Tears. The long path, the steppes of Eastern Europe are vast and flat and indifferent, stretching to every horizon without shelter or landmark. In autumn, the wind comes off the Black Sea cold and sharp and constant. The captives walked or were mounted on horses behind their captors if they were young and healthy and worth preserving. Those who could not keep up were not waited for. Alexandra was young. She was healthy. She was, by all the evidence that would later accumulate around her story, extraordinarily beautiful. These qualities, which in another world would have been simple blessings, in this moment made her valuable. And value, in this context, was the only protection a person had. The journey to Kaffa, the great slave market on the southern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, took weeks. Kaffa, the city the ancient Greeks had called Theodosia, the city the Genoese had fortified and enriched, the city that sat at the very edge of the known world where Europe ended and something else began. By the early 16th century, it was one of the largest slave markets on earth. Tens of thousands of captives passed through its gates every year. taken from Poland, from Lithuania, from Ruthenia, from the Russian principalities to the north. The market itself was a place of structured horror, not chaotic violence, something worse than that, something businesslike and methodical. The captives were housed in holding pens, fed enough to keep them presentable, examined by merchants who assessed their teeth and their hands and their eyes with the same detached expertise a farmer might bring to appraising livestock. For Alexandra, this examination would have been the deepest humiliation yet visited upon her. To have her face turned by a stranger's hand, to have her body assessed for its monetary worth, to understand in the most visceral and undeniable way that she was no longer a person in the eyes of the people who now controlled her fate. She was a commodity, and yet she was also extraordinary. Even here, even under these conditions, something must have been visible to those who looked at her. Not just beauty in the conventional sense, though she possessed that, too. Something in the eyes, perhaps. Something alert and present and not broken. Not yet. Not ever, as it would turn out. The auction was a public event. Buyers from across the Mediterranean world attended the great markets of Kaffa. Ottoman traders, Persian merchants, wealthy households from Egypt and Syria and North Africa, the most prized captives, those who were young, healthy, educated enough to be useful, beautiful enough to be desired, were sold at prices that represented fortunes. We do not know the specific circumstances of her sale. The slave trade of the early 16th century was not a single transaction, but often a chain of them, each link moving a person further from their origin and closer to their final destination. What we know is that she crossed the Black Sea, that ancient body of water, dark and cold and heavy with history. She would have crossed it on a merchant vessel below deck with other captives, watching through whatever gap she could find as the coastline of Crimea receded and disappeared, and there was nothing in every direction but water and the sound of wind in the rigging and the long, wordless grief of everything left behind. And then, on the far side of that water, Constantinople, Istanbul, the city, the capital of the Ottoman Empire at the absolute peak of its power and expansion. A city of 500,000 souls at a time when most European capitals counted their inhabitants in the tens of thousands. A city of minarets and covered markets, of aqueducts and hammams, of 12,000 shops in the Grand Bazaar alone. A city that smelled of spices and salt water and horse dung and roses, all at once, inescapably, for a girl from Rohatyn who had never seen a city larger than a modest market town. The arrival in Istanbul would have been incomprehensible. The scale of it, the noise, the languages, Turkish and Arabic and Greek and Farsi and Armenian and Ladino, all layered over each other in the streets of the waterfront. The architecture, the great domes of the mosques rising above everything, the walls of the Topkapi palace visible on the headland above the harbor. She arrived here as cargo, as a number in a ledger, as one girl among the hundreds who came off the ships every week in the slave markets of Istanbul. And she was selected. Somehow, among all of them, she was selected. She was taken from the general market, from the ordinary stream of commerce that fed servants and laborers and concubines, into the households of Istanbul's wealthy citizens, and she was directed instead toward the imperial harem, toward the palace itself, toward the household of Sultan Suleiman, the ruler of an empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to the Persian border. How this selection happened, we do not know precisely. Perhaps an agent of the imperial household scanned the new arrivals with trained eyes, looking for exactly the combination of qualities that made a girl suitable, not just for beauty, but for survival in the most politically complex household on earth: youth, health, intelligence visible in the face, composure that had not yet shattered. She possessed all of these things. She had possessed them throughout the entire ordeal of the past weeks. The raid, the march, the market, the crossing. None of it had broken the particular quality of her presence. Battered, frightened, stripped of everything external, she was still, somehow, herself. She entered the gates of the imperial harem with nothing. No family anywhere on earth who could reach her. No language that anyone around her spoke. No name that anyone would use again. No map of this new world, no guide, no friend, no precedent for what her life might become or how to navigate it. She had only whatever she had been before the smoke rose over Rohatyn. Whatever her father's prayers had planted in her. Whatever she had learned in the quiet, ordinary mornings of a life that was gone. It was enough. As history would slowly, astonishingly reveal, it was more than enough. She had crossed a threshold that no map could mark, and no prayer could fully prepare a person for. The gates of the old palace, the Eski Saray, closed behind her with a sound that was not dramatic. It was quiet, a low, wooden final sound. And that quietness was the first lesson the harem would teach her. This was not a place of screaming. It was a place of stillness, of watching, of learning to say everything with the angle of your shoulders and the direction of your eyes, because words were a currency spent carefully here. If spent at all. The Eski Saray stood on the third hill of Istanbul, surrounded by high walls that the outside world could not see past. It was not a prison in any legal sense, but walls do not need a legal definition to confine. Hundreds of women lived inside those walls, women from every corner of the empire and beyond it, women who had been taken, bought, gifted, and delivered to this singular world as living expressions of Ottoman power and reach. What did a girl do in such a world in the first hours? She watched. She listened. She understood, slowly and then all at once, that she was at the bottom of a hierarchy so elaborate and so ancient that it had its own language, its own calendar, its own geography. At the summit of this hierarchy sat the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Her word was the architecture of every day lived inside those walls. Beneath her, the senior wives held their status like gemstones, earned over years, protected with vigilance. Beneath them, the favored ones moved through the corridors with a careful awareness of their own fragile standing. And at the very foundation, the newest arrivals, the Assimi, the untrained, the unformed, the girls who had just come through those quiet gates. She was a Simi. She was raw material in a system designed to refine. The education she received was not gentle, but it was thorough. She was assigned to an usta, an experienced teacher, who began the slow work of transformation. Turkish first, the language of the court, of the corridors, of survival. She was a quick student, People who observed her in this early period recalled a quality that was difficult to name precisely. A readiness, perhaps, an alertness, as if her mind had been waiting for something to learn and was grateful to finally have it. She studied the Quran. She learned to write in the Ottoman script, moving the pen right to left across the page. She learned the protocols of the harem, who was addressed first, which room required which gesture of deference, which hour of the day belonged to which ritual. She learned to move through a space as if she belonged in it, which is, in the end, the deepest lesson any institution can teach. The days had a rhythm, morning prayers before the light fully arrived, lessons in the long midday hours, needlework in the afternoons, the soft and closed evenings when the lamps were lit and the harem became a world of amber and shadow, and the women talked in low voices about things that mattered only to them. In those quiet, lamplight evenings, she began to make herself known, not loudly, carefully, with humor, because what else could reliably soften the tedium of confinement, the weight of grief for a life left behind? She made the women around her laugh, not with cruelty, with the warm, observational humor of someone who found the strangeness of existence genuinely amusing and wanted to share that amusement with the people nearest to her. This quality was noticed. In a world defined by silence and subtlety, laughter was significant, and so she was given a name, Hurrem, from the Persian meaning the joyful one, the cheerful one, the one who brings happiness. The naming of a slave girl in the Ottoman harem was not a trivial act. It was a formal acknowledgment that she had successfully transitioned from raw arrival to recognized member of this world. The conversion to Islam accompanied this naming. For a slave girl in the Ottoman system, conversion was expected, administratively routine, and yet it was also for those who experienced it sincerely something more. Whether she came to her faith gradually, or with the sudden clarity that sometimes arrives in lives that have been violently reordered, is something history cannot fully answer. What history does record is that she wore it as a woman who understood that identity is rebuilt from the materials available, and she was building. She was Hurrem now. The girl from Rohatyn was not gone. She was layered beneath and then came the night in the language of the harem. The path to the Sultan's chambers had a name spoken with reverence and dread and longing in equal measure. The Golden Road. The girl chosen to walk it was prepared with extraordinary care, bathed in water scented with oils, dressed in silk and brocade, adorned with jewelry selected to complement rather than overwhelm. She was given instruction in how to enter the room, how to bow, how to walk in the specific manner prescribed by centuries of protocol. A girl chosen for the Golden Road was being sent forward into a moment that could define the entire remaining arc of her life, or could mean nothing. Many were summoned once and not again, returning to the same quiet corridors, the same lamplight evenings, indistinguishable from before, except in their own minds. The year was likely 1520. Suleiman had been Sultan for only a few years. He was young, not yet 30, already carrying the enormous weight of ruling one of the most powerful empires in the world. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man of genuine intellectual depth. He wrote poetry under the pen name Mohibi, the loving one. He was interested in ideas. He was capable of boredom, in the way that very intelligent people can find. to the performance of power are capable of boredom. Hurrem walked the golden road. What happened in that room belongs to the category of historical moments that leave there evidence in aftermath rather than in direct record. And the aftermath was extraordinary. He sent for her again. He sent for her again after that. The pattern that established itself over the following weeks was unlike anything the harem's long institutional memory contained. Sultans had favorites. Every sultan had favorites. But the relationship that developed between Suleiman and Hurrem had a quality that the women who observed it found difficult to categorize. He did not simply call for her in the manner of a man demanding entertainment. He called for her in the manner of a man who wanted to talk and found that talking extended into the night, and that the night passed more quickly in her presence than in any other. She talked to him about what she had read, which by now was considerable, about the nature of justice, a subject that interested him deeply, given that his imperial title would come to include Kanuni, the lawgiver, about poetry. She wrote poetry herself, in Turkish, with the quality that genuine poets among his courtiers acknowledge with the reluctant admiration of people who recognize craft in an unexpected source. And she made him laugh. In a life defined by ceremony and the crushing loneliness that is the specific inheritance of absolute power, she offered him something that could not be manufactured by court protocol. She offered him the experience of being known by another person, of having his ideas met, contested, appreciated, and reflected back by a mind that was genuinely engaged, rather than performing engagement. This was not merely beauty, though she was considered beautiful by the standards of her time. Whatever she had been before the smoke rose over Rohatyn, her father's daughter, a girl who asked questions, a person who found the world genuinely interesting, that self had survived, and was now in the lamplight chambers of the greatest sultan of the age, finding its fullest expression. And then, in the year 1521, she gave him a son. The boy was named Mehmed, the most honored name in the Ottoman tradition, drawn from the name of the prophet and carrying the weight of Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The birth of a son transformed everything. In the formal mathematics of the Ottoman harem, a woman who had given the Sultan a living son became a Hasaki. She mattered. She had legal standing. She had a formal position in the hierarchy that could not be easily removed. She was given larger apartments. She was given an increased allowance. She was given servants of her own. The women who had been her peers in the corridors were now, subtly but unmistakably, her subordinates. This transformation was not celebrated by everyone. In those corridors, the envy that surrounded her was of a particular, specific character. Not the simple envy of beauty or favor, but the deeper, more dangerous envy of women who understood that the mathematics of this world had just shifted. The harem was a system of limited resources. The Sultan's time, his attention, his recognition, his legal acknowledgement of sons. Every calculation in her favor was, from the perspective of the other women, a calculation against them. She understood this. She had been living inside this world long enough to read its internal weather. She read the silences. She read the angle of shoulders and the direction of eyes, just as she had learned in those first quiet months of watching. The envy was most concentrated in one direction, and that direction had a name that Hurrem would need to speak carefully and think about constantly for years to come. But that is the story of what came next. For now, in the first weeks after Mem's birth, she held her son in the lamplight of her new apartments, and something in her that had been held in suspension since the smoke rose over Rohatyn began slowly to settle. She was Hurrem's Sultan. She had arrived. The envy was most concentrated in one direction, and that direction had a name, Mahidevran Sultan, the mother of Prince Mustafa, the woman who had held Suleiman's favor for years before a girl from Rohatyn ever stepped into the harem. She had borne him his firstborn son, his heir, and for a long time that had been enough to anchor her place in the hierarchy of power. But now, after Mem's birth, after the promotions, after the apartments and the gifts and the undeniable shift in the Sultan's attention, Mahidevran could feel the ground beneath her eroding, slowly, like sand pulled back by an invisible tide. What happens when two women, bound by proximity and divided by ambition, are forced to share the same space, the same master, the same silent battlefield? They do not speak their hatred aloud. They do not need to. It lives in the way they pass each other in corridors without acknowledgement. It lives in the way Mahidevran's attendants whisper too loudly when Hurrem enters a room. It lives in the way Hurrem accepts gifts from the Sultan in full view of the older concubine, her face composed, her gratitude expressed just a fraction too sweetly. The harem becomes a theater of microaggressions, of coded insults delivered through gesture and silence. Each woman watches the other with the sharpness of a predator observing prey. Each knows that the Sultan's favor is not infinite, that there is only so much sunlight in the garden, and one of them is beginning to cast a very long shadow. Hurrem does not initiate the war, but she does not retreat from it either. She learns quickly that in this world, perception is currency, that to be seen as weak is to invite destruction. So she walks with her head high. She dresses in fabrics that catch the light. She makes certain that when the Sultan calls for her, she arrives radiant, composed, utterly present. And Mahidevran, watching from her own quarters, feels the slow burn of irrelevance creeping into her bones. The breaking point arrives not in a throne room, not in a council meeting, but in a dim hallway of the old palace in the late afternoon, when the air is thick and the servants have retreated to prepare the evening meal. Hurrem is returning from the baths, her hair still damp, wrapped in a towel, her skin flushed from the heat. She is flanked by two attendants, young girls who keep their eyes down and say nothing. She does not see Mahidevran until it is too late. The older woman steps out from a side passage, her face a mask of rage barely held in check. Her voice is low, venomous. She speaks in Turkish, words that Hurrem understands perfectly now, words that accuse her of witchcraft, of seduction, of stealing what does not belong to her. Hurrem stops. She does not respond immediately. She knows that silence in this moment is a weapon. But Mahidevran does not want silence. She wants blood. The first blow comes fast. A slap across the face that snaps Hurrem's head to the side and sends one of the attendants stumbling backward in shock. The second blow is harder, a closed fist that catches her near the eye, and suddenly Hurrem is on the ground, her vision blurred, her hands raised instinctively to protect herself. Mahidevran is on her then, pulling at her hair, her nails raking across Hurrem's cheek, leaving deep, burning scratches. The attendants scream. Footsteps echo down the corridor. But for a few brutal seconds, there is only the violence, raw and unfiltered. The older woman's fury pouring out in a torrent. That has been building for months. When the guards finally pull Mahidevran away, Hurrem is left on the cold stone floor, her face bloodied, her lips split, her eye already beginning to swell shut. She does not cry. She does not make a sound. She simply lies there, breathing slowly, feeling the pain settle into her bones. And in that pain, in the humiliation of being struck down like a common servant, she finds something unexpected. Clarity. She is carried back to her chambers. A physician is summoned. Her wounds are cleaned, treated with salves and ointments that sting and smell of herbs. The women around her whisper in horror, in pity. They tell her to rest, to recover quietly, to let the incident pass. But Hurrem does not rest. She sits by the window, staring out at the gardens, her face bruised and swollen, and she thinks. She thinks about leverage, about the rules of this place, about the fact that she has just been given something more valuable than gold. When the Sultan sends word that he wishes to see her that evening, she sends back a message. She will not come. She will not see him. Not like this. Not until her honor has been restored. The refusal is unprecedented. Concubines do not refuse the Sultan. They do not make demands. They do not withhold themselves. But Hurrem is no longer thinking like a concubine. She is thinking like a strategist. She knows that Suleiman is a man of justice, a man who prides himself on order and fairness. She knows that he will not tolerate violence in his harem, especially violence directed at the mother of his child. And she knows that by refusing to see him, by forcing him to confront the reality of what has happened, she is placing the burden of action squarely on his shoulders. Suleiman arrives at her door the next morning, not summoning her to him, but coming to her. He enters the room quietly, without ceremony, and when he sees her face, the bruises, the scratches, the way she turns away from him as if in shame, something in his expression hardens. He asks her what happened. She tells him. She does not embellish. She does not weep. She simply recounts the facts, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on the floor. And then she says the words that will change everything. She cannot continue like this. She cannot live in fear. She cannot raise their son in a place where his mother is treated like a slave, subject to the whims and violence of others. If she is to remain here, if she is to serve him as he wishes, then she must be given the protection that her position demands. She must be freed. The request hangs in the air between them. Freeing a concubine is not unheard of, but freeing the mother of a prince, elevating her beyond the status of a mere slave, granting her legal autonomy is a decision with weight. It is a signal, a declaration, and Suleiman knows it. He looks at her for a long time, this girl from Rohatyn who has somehow managed to turn a brutal assault into a negotiation. And then he nods. The manumission is drawn up within days. A formal document, signed and sealed, declaring that Hurrem is no longer a slave. She is a free woman. She can own property. She can make contracts. She can, in theory, leave the palace if she chooses. Of course, she does not choose. She has no intention of leaving. But the document changes everything. It removes the last legal barrier between her and the Sultan, and it opens a door that no one, not even Hurrem herself, had fully anticipated, because if she is free, then she can marry, and if she can marry, then Suleiman can marry her. The idea is radical. Ottoman sultans do not marry. They have concubines, favorites, mothers of their children, but they do not enter into legal binding marriages. Marriage implies partnership, equality, a sharing of power that dilutes the absolute authority of the throne. For over 2 centuries, the custom has been ironclad. But Suleiman is not a man bound by custom when custom conflicts with his own sense of justice and desire. He is the lawgiver. He is the master of the empire. And if he wishes to marry the woman who has borne him sons, who has stood beside him through grief and joy, who has proven herself again and again to be unlike any other, then he will marry her. The ceremony is arranged in secret at first, then announced with a grandeur that shakes the court to its foundations. It takes place in the gardens of the old palace, beneath a canopy of embroidered silk, with witnesses drawn from the highest ranks of the empire. Hurrem wears robes of crimson and gold, her hair braided and adorned with pearls, her bruises faded but still faintly visible beneath the cosmetics. She stands beside Suleiman, her hand in his, and the imam recites the words that bind them together, not as master and concubine, but as husband and wife. The shock ripples through the harem, through the court, through the streets of Istanbul. There are whispers of scandal, of impropriety, of a sultan bewitched by a foreign woman. But there is also awe, because in that single act, Suleiman has done what no Ottoman ruler has done in living memory. He has elevated a slave girl to the status of empress. He has made her, legally and irrevocably, his equal partner. And Hurrem, standing in the garden with the scent of roses heavy in the air, understands that she has crossed a threshold from which there is no return. She is no longer Hurrem Sultan, favored concubine. She is Hurrem Sultan, legal wife of the most powerful man in the world. And Mahidevran, watching from a distant window, knows that the war is over, and that she has lost. There is a moment in the life of every great strategist when fate offers them a door, and they do not hesitate to walk through it. For Hurrem Sultan, that door was made of smoke and flame dot. It was sometime around 1532 or 33. The exact year is lost beneath the ash. What is known, what the chronicles preserve in careful, measured language, is that a devastating fire broke out at the old palace, the Eski Saray, the vast enclosed world that had housed the women of the Ottoman harem for generations. The fire was catastrophic. It consumed corridors, chambers, private gardens. It rendered entire wings uninhabitable. The women inside had to be evacuated, relocated, scattered to temporary quarters across the city. For most, this was a crisis, a terrifying rupture in the only world they had ever known. For Hurrem, it was something else entirely. What does a woman of extraordinary intelligence do when the walls of her cage suddenly fall away? She does not wait for them to be rebuilt. The old palace stood at some distance from Topkapi, the grand imperial complex perched on the peninsula where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, where the divan convened, where ministers deliberated, where ambassadors were received, where the actual machinery of the most powerful empire on earth turned, and ground and produced decisions that shaped the lives of millions. The old palace was comfortable. It was gilded. It was also, by design, a place of separation. The harem and the seat of power were meant to be kept apart. This was not an accident of architecture. It was policy. It was tradition. It was the way things had always been. Hurrem Sultan understood all of this. And then she moved to Topkapi anyway. The precise mechanism of how she achieved, this is a question historians have examined for centuries. The fire provided the practical justification, but a fire alone does not move a woman into the Sultan's own palace. What moved her there was something far more fundamental, the complete and absolute trust of Suleiman the Magnificent himself. She did not storm the gates of Topkapi. She was invited through them by the one man in the world who could make that invitation mean something permanent. She took up residence within the Topkapi complex, within the innermost spaces of the imperial household, and she did not leave. Not for the rest of her life. Consider what this meant in practical terms. The old palace had been a world unto itself, with its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, its own distance from the levers of power. The women who lived there heard about decisions after they were made. They received news through intermediaries, through whispers, through the filtered reports of servants and eunuchs. They were present in the empire, but not of it. Topkapi was different. Topkapi was the center of the world. Within its walls, the imperial council, the divan, met 4 times a week to govern an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Black Sea to the shores of North Africa. The Sultan's private apartments, the throne rooms, the treasury, the reception halls for foreign dignitaries, all of it was here contained within a series of courtyards and gates, each one a layer of increasing intimacy and power. And now Hurrem Sultan was here too, watching, listening, thinking. She placed herself at the very heart of the empire's political machinery, and the machinery was never quite the same again. What sustains a woman's influence over a sultan who commands the armies of the world? What keeps her voice the one he listens to when 1,000 other voices compete for his attention? The answer in Hurrem's case was not beauty alone. It was never merely beauty. It was the quality of her mind and the specific usefulness of that mind during the long and brutal absences that Suleiman's role demanded of him. Suleiman was a campaigning sultan. His reign was defined by military expansion on a scale that required his personal presence on the field. He rode to Hungary. He marched to Persia. He directed sieges that lasted months. He was away from Istanbul for seasons at a time, sometimes for years, separated from the capital by roads that swallowed messengers and made communication slow and uncertain. During these absences, the empire had to be governed, and governed carefully, and the Sultan had to trust that what was happening in his absence reflected his own will and judgment. Hurrem Sultan became, in the most functional sense of the word, his eyes and ears and voice within the capital dot. Their correspondence during these campaigns is among the most remarkable documents to survive from the 16th century. They wrote to each other constantly. Suleiman's letters to Hurrem are famous for their extraordinary tenderness. The verses he composed for her in his capacity as a poet, the declarations of longing that a military commander of his stature was not expected to put into writing at all. But Hurrem's letters to him were something different in character. They were precise. They were informative. They contained political intelligence, observations about the mood of the court, careful assessments of who was loyal and who was not, details about the governance of the capital, that only someone positioned at the center of events could have known or conveyed. She was his advisor, not in a ceremonial or decorative sense, in the actual, operational sense of the word. She gave him information he needed. She gave him perspective he could not obtain at a distance, and he valued it. He acted on it. He trusted it. This relationship, intellectual as much as personal, was what made Hurrem Sultan genuinely dangerous to those who sought power for themselves. And there was one man, above all others, who understood exactly how dangerous she had become. Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, a man who had been Suleiman's closest companion since childhood, who had risen from a position of favor to the very summit of imperial administration, who had commanded armies and negotiated treaties and accumulated wealth and influence on a scale that made him, in the eyes of many, almost a co-ruler. But Ibrahim, politically astute, enormously capable, and almost completely certain of his own indispensability. Suleiman called him his dearest friend. He called himself, in moments that bordered on arrogance, almost an equal to the Sultan himself. He had been granted extraordinary powers, extraordinary titles, extraordinary access. He was also Hurrem Sultan's most formidable obstacle. Ibrahim and Hurrem understood each other with the clear, cold clarity of two people who want the same thing, which is the ear of the most powerful man in the world, and know that there is not unlimited space for both of them to have it. Their conflict was not loud in the beginning. It did not play out in scenes of open confrontation. It was a slower, more careful thing, a contest of positioning and patience and the careful accumulation of advantage. Hurrem was patient. She was extraordinarily patient. She understood that Ibrahim's position was built on decades of intimacy with Suleiman, on military campaigns shared, on a bond of male friendship that she could not directly attack without risking her own credibility. So she did not attack it directly. She observed. She waited. She allowed Ibrahim's own nature to begin working against him. And Ibrahim's nature, brilliant as it was, contained a fatal flaw. Pride. Over the years, the accumulation of his power had made him careless with the boundaries of appropriate behavior. He made decisions that exceeded his mandate. He made statements that implied an equivalence with the Sultan that the Sultan himself had not explicitly granted. He cultivated relationships with foreign powers in ways that could be read as independent, diplomacy rather than service to the empire. He accumulated enemies among the senior officials of the court, men who resented his dominance and who, when they looked for an alternative center of influence, increasingly looked toward Harem Sultan. She did not manufacture Ibrahim's downfall. She did not need to. She positioned herself to benefit from it, and she ensured that the information reaching Suleiman about his Grand Vizier was accurate and complete and framed in terms that the Sultan's own judgment could assess clearly. Hurrem was not a schemer who invented falsehoods. She was a strategist who ensured that truths were heard. In 1536, Suleiman summoned Ibrahim Pasha to dine with him at Topkapi. The meal ended. The night passed. And in the morning, Ibrahim Pasha was dead. Strangled by order of the Sultan he had served for more than a decade. The official record was brief. The reasons given were vague. But the result was absolute. The greatest rival Hurrem Sultan had ever faced was gone. His vast wealth was confiscated. His name was, in many contexts, erased. The position of Grand Vizier passed to other men who did not possess Ibrahim's independent authority, men who were more clearly subordinate to the Sultan's will, and by extension, more navigable for a woman who had made herself indispensable to that will. Hurrem, Sultan, had not simply survived at the center of the world. She had reshaped what that center looked like. She had moved from the margins of power to its innermost chamber, and she had removed the one figure standing between her and absolute influence over the man who ruled everything. The rose garden she had walked through on her wedding day was behind her now. What lay ahead was something far larger and far more consequential than any garden could contain. She stood at the heart of the empire, and the empire, whether it knew it or not, had begun to move in the shape of her intentions. She stood at the heart of the empire, and the empire, whether it knew it or not, had begun to move in the shape of her intentions. She had not simply survived at the center of the world. She had reshaped what that center looked like. She had moved from the margins of power to its innermost chamber, and had removed the one figure standing between her, an absolute influence over the man who ruled everything. The rose garden she had walked through on her wedding day was behind her now. What lay ahead was something far larger and far more consequential than any garden could contain. What does a woman do when the throne is not hers to claim, but the empire can still be shaped by her hands? She builds. She builds in stone and in mortar, and in the permanent memory of cities. She builds in the quiet language of soup and water and shelter, extended to those who have nothing. She builds in ink and parchment, in letters carried across deserts and mountain ranges to the courts of kings who have never seen her face. And she builds in the future, in the bodies and fates of her children, placing them, one by one, like stones in an arch, so that when she is gone, the structure will hold. Hurrem Sultan, by the time she entered the fullest expression of her power, was no longer simply the woman Suleiman loved. She was an institution. She possessed her own household, her own treasury, her own staff of administrators, her own networks of information that stretched from the Black Sea to the Red. The wealth that had accumulated around her was not merely personal. It was political. It was architectural. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, monumental, and she chose to spend it on the people who would never know her name. The complex she commissioned in the Tangiu Aksaray district of Istanbul was deliberate in scale and in ambition. She had resources. She had access to the greatest architectural mind the Ottoman world had ever produced, and she used both without hesitation. Mimar Sinan. Say the name slowly and feel the weight of it. He was the chief imperial architect, a former soldier who had converted from Christianity and risen through the ranks of the Janissary corps before discovering, late in a life that would span nearly a century, that his true gift was the translation of divine geometry into stone. He would go on to build the Suleimani Mosque, the Selimai Mosque at Edirne, structures that still stand today as some of the finest achievements of human civilization. Suleiman trusted him absolutely, and Hurrem, understanding what trust in an architect could produce, directed his genius toward her own vision. The Hasaki Sultan complex rose in Istanbul during the 1500s and 30s and 40s, a testament not to royal vanity, but to deliberate social purpose. Its name, Haseki, was her title. Her mark was on every arch, but what stood within those arches was not a monument to her own grandeur. It was a mosque, a madrasa, a school of learning, a hospital, the first in Istanbul built explicitly for women, a soup kitchen designed to feed those who had nothing, and a primary school to educate the children of the poor. Let that settle for a moment. The first hospital in Istanbul designated for women, built by a woman who had once arrived in that city as a slave, with no name, no language, no standing of any kind. She did not stop in Istanbul, in Mecca. She funded the renovation of the soup kitchen that served pilgrims on the Hajj. Tens of thousands of pilgrims traveled there each year, and among them were always the destitute, those who had sold everything to make the journey and arrived with nothing left to sustain themselves. She fed them, quietly, without requiring that they know who she was in Jerusalem. She established a soup kitchen that served hundreds every day, a caravanserai, a resting place for travelers moving through the ancient roads of the Levant, and additional facilities woven into the fabric of a city that had known, across its long history, almost every kind of human hunger. In Edirne, she funded a bath that served both the public and the pilgrims passing through on their way to the Holy Lands. Baths in the Ottoman world were not luxuries. They were necessities, places of ritual cleansing accessible even to those who owned almost nothing. Power extended downward, toward the pilgrim resting his feet in Jerusalem, toward the widow waiting at the soup kitchen in Mecca, toward the sick woman in an Istanbul hospital who has never heard your name. That is legacy. That is the kind of authority that does not require an army to defend it, because it has already been written into the gratitude of the living and the memory of the dead. But building was only one of the languages she had learned to speak. The other was diplomacy, and in that arena she did something no woman in the Ottoman imperial household had done before her, at least not openly, not in letters that still survive to this day. She wrote to kings. Sigismund II Augustus, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, was among the most educated monarchs in Europe during the mid-16th century. His kingdom occupied a precarious diplomatic position, geographically squeezed between the Ottomans to the south, the Habsburgs to the west, and the rising power of Muscovy to the north. A warm relationship with Istanbul was not merely preferable, it was existential. When Sigismund sent gifts to the Ottoman court, Hurrem responded, not through a scribe, not through a protocol officer. In her own voice and letters that bore her personal seal, she thanked the king for his generosity and signaled, with diplomatic elegance, that she was a presence worth cultivating. She was not merely relaying Suleiman's sentiments. She was establishing herself as an independent actor in the relationship between the two. States that no previous royal consort in the Ottoman household had conducted independent diplomatic correspondence with a foreign head of state. The harem was supposed to be the end of the story, the place where women were contained, not the place from which they reached outward into the world. Hurrem, writing to Sigismund, was redefining what the harem was. She wrote also to Shah Tahmasp of Persia. The Safavid Shah was Suleiman's most formidable rival. But even between enemies, there were moments when silk and carefully worded letters moved between courts. when the language of ceremony created channels that military conflict could not entirely close. Hurrem's letter to the Shah, accompanying gifts, was written with formal grace, but it was unmistakably her letter, her voice, her position. She was not asking anyone's permission. The woman who had once been forbidden from speaking to anyone outside the walls of the old palace was now writing to the rulers of Poland and Persia. And the empire did not stop her, because the empire had learned that Hurrem Sultan's interventions, whether in stone or in ink, tended to produce outcomes that served the Ottoman interest. She was not a complication. She was a resource. And yet beneath all of this building, all of this diplomacy, there moved a current that was darker and more intimate. The question of succession. Suleiman had sons from before Hurrem, and he had sons with Hurrem. The eldest surviving son from before her, Prince Mustafa, was talented, beloved by the Janissaries, admired in the provinces where he served as governor, and widely regarded as the natural heir to the Ottoman throne. He was everything a prince was supposed to be. He was to Hurrem's sons an obstacle that time alone would not remove. What precisely Hurrem did to alter Mustafa's fate is a question historians have debated for centuries. The accusations made against her were vivid, that she poisoned the Sultan's trust in his eldest son, that she worked through her son-in-law Rustem Pasha, who was Grand Vizier, to plant false reports of Mustafa's ambitions, suggesting to Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting to seize the throne before it was offered. Whether she orchestrated it or contributed to it in ways that cannot now be measured with certainty, the outcome was devastating. In the year 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his military camp. The prince came. He entered the Sultan's tent. He did not come out alive. Suleiman had his eldest and most capable son strangled by mutes, the imperial executioners, inside a campaign tent. While the army waited outside in silence, the Janissaries wept. The empire went quiet with grief and horror. Mustafa was buried, and the path to the throne opened, slowly, painfully, before Hurrem's sons. Did she want this? Did she cause it? Did she simply understand, with the cold clarity of a woman who had survived everything, that the empire could hold only one heir at a time, and that her children would not survive Mustafa's reign? Perhaps the question is not answerable. History, at its most intimate, keeps its own counsel. What can be said is this: Hurrem Sultan had bound her fate. From the first moment she understood what fate meant in the Ottoman court to the fate of her children. Every stone she laid in Istanbul and Jerusalem and Mecca, every letter she sent to Sigismund and Tahmasp, every year of trust and influence she had built beside Suleiman, all of it pointed toward a future in which her blood would sit on the Ottoman throne. She was not finished yet, but the pieces were in place. And somewhere in the Topkapi palace, in a room filled with the soft light of oil lamps and the distant sound of water moving through the fountains below, she sat with the weight of an empire in her hands and continued, quietly, to shape it. And somewhere in the Topkapi palace, in a room filled with the soft light of oil lamps and the distant sound of water moving through the fountains below, she sat with the weight of an empire in her hands and continued, quietly, to shape it. But empires, like all living things, exist inside the boundaries of time, and time, in its quiet and indifferent way, had already begun its work on Hurrem Sultan by the 1550s. Those who knew her closely could see it. A stillness had settled around her that was different from the stillness of power. It was the stillness of a body beginning to loosen its grip on the world. She had spent decades at the center of everything, writing letters, receiving ambassadors, directing the construction of hospitals and soup kitchens, guiding the education of her sons, whispering counsel into the ear of the most powerful man alive. And now the pace of all of that slowed, not because her mind had dimmed. It had not, but because her body at last was asking her to rest. She was, by the estimates of historians, somewhere between 45 and 55 years old in her final years. No one recorded her birth with precision. She had arrived in the Ottoman world as a captive girl without a documented history, and so even the number of years she had lived remained a kind of mystery. But the years themselves had left their marks. She moved more carefully. She tired more easily. The physical resilience that had carried her through childbirth, through palace intrigue, through years of political maneuvering, was quieter now. And yet, what those final years gave her was something she had perhaps never fully had before. Time, unguarded, unscheduled time, spent beside Suleiman. There is a particular intimacy that belongs only to those who have grown old together, who have shared not just the bright moments, but the long, ordinary silences between them. Suleiman and Hurrem had that. They had survived the execution of Ibrahim Pasha, the death of their son Mehmed, the anguish of Mustafa, the weight of decades of war and governance. And now, in these quieter years, they existed alongside one another with the ease of two people who no longer needed to explain themselves. He wrote her poetry still. She, it is believed, wrote back. The letters between them, those extraordinary documents that had stunned European courts when they were first intercepted and translated, had established long ago that this was not a conventional relationship between a sultan and his concubine. It was something rarer, something that looked, from every angle, like love. She spent time in the palace gardens. She continued her charitable correspondence. She remained, in her way, present in the world of the empire. But the great campaigns of her life, the campaign to legitimize herself, to secure her sons, to reshape the architecture of Ottoman power, those were largely complete. What remained was simply living, and she did that, it seems, with grace. What does it mean to face the end of a life that has been as full as hers? What does a woman who began as a slave, who became a queen, who outlasted enemies and rivals and the suspicions of an entire civilization, think about as the light begins to fade? We do not know. We cannot know. History did not record her private thoughts in those final months. What it recorded, instead, was the fact of her death. Hurrem Sultan died in the spring of 1558. The exact date given in Ottoman records is the 18th of April. She died inside the Topkapi palace, in the place that had been her world for more than 3 decades. She was surrounded, it is believed, by the household she had built, by the servants who had attended her, by the physical objects of a life embedded in that magnificent and complex structure of stone and tile, and Suleiman was with her, or nearby. The accounts differ in their details, but they agree on one thing. The loss struck him with a force that was not political, not strategic, not ceremonial. It was personal. It was grief in its most ordinary and devastating form. A man had lost the person he loved most. He did not campaign that spring. He withdrew. For a ruler whose adult life had been defined by movement, by the constant rhythm of military campaigns and imperial governance, this withdrawal was itself a kind of testament. The empire continued as empires must. The machinery of the divan and the treasury and the janissaries and the provincial governors kept turning. But at the center of it, the Sultan was still. Contemporary sources, including the letters of the Habsburg ambassador Ogier Gisland de Busbecq, noted the depth of Suleiman's mourning. European courts, which had long regarded Hurrem with fascination and suspicion, understood now that she had been no mere political instrument. She had been, to him, irreplaceable. He mourned her for the remainder of his life. He never remarried. He never elevated another woman to any comparable position. The harem continued to function as an institution, as it always had, but Hurrem's place in it, that singular, unprecedented, legally recognized place, was never filled again. It was as if the architecture of his emotional world had lost a wall, and he simply lived in the open space that remained. And then he turned to stone, in the way that men of power sometimes turn their grief into monuments. Within a year of her death, construction began on a mausoleum for Hurrem's Sultan, placed in the courtyard of the Suleimani Mosque, the great complex that Suleiman had commissioned as the architectural statement of his reign. To place her tomb there beside his own future resting place was a declaration of permanence. Designed by the imperial architect Mimar Sinan, the structure was octagonal, covered by a single great dome, its interior sheathed in magnificent Iznik tiles of deep blue and green, and the distinctive Ottoman red dot. It was beautiful. It was worthy of her. And Suleiman, 8 years later, would be laid to rest just beside it in his own mausoleum, so that in death they remained what they had been in life, adjacent, inseparable. But she had not finished her work simply by dying. The ambitions she had carried for decades, the careful positioning, the strategic marriages, the cultivation of her son Selim's prospects, those ambitions outlived her, and they bore fruit. When Suleiman died in September of 1566, 8 years after Hurrem, he died in the field outside the Hungarian fortress of Sigetvar on campaign at 71. His death was kept secret for days while the succession was managed, and when the news was finally released, there was no question. Hurrem's son Selim was the surviving legitimate prince. His brothers were dead. The path she had cleared through patience and ruthlessness and the long, slow work of decades was open. Selim II ascended the throne in 1566, becoming Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was not a military ruler in the mold of his father, and history has not always been generous to him. But he reigned for 8 years, and the structures his mother had built around him continued to support him. Hurrem had wanted this. She had wanted it from the moment she first understood that the Ottoman succession was not guaranteed by birth order, but won through survival. She had maneuvered through the deaths of sons she had not wanted to lose, through the execution of Mustafa, which carried its own terrible weight, through the isolation of Bayezid, which ended in his death in Persia. And at the end of all of it, Selim sat on the throne. Her blood, her work, her victory. But what does a woman leave behind when she leaves behind a sultan? She leaves behind a precedent, and precedents in history are among the most powerful things there are. Harem Sultan is recognized today as the founding figure of the Sultanate of Women, a period stretching roughly from the 1520s to the late 17th century, during which the mothers and wives of Ottoman sultans exercised decisive political influence over the empire. The women who followed her, Nurbanu Sultan, Safi Sultan, Kosum Sultan, built their power in the space she had opened, corresponding with foreign monarchs managing regencies, shaping the empire during reigns of sultans who were sometimes young, sometimes simply absent. None of this was inevitable. It became possible because she had demonstrated that it was. She did not set out to found a dynasty of powerful women. She set out to survive. She set out to protect her children. And in doing all of that, she changed the architecture of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. There is a tile panel in the mausoleum of Hurrem, Sultan, at the Suleimani complex in Istanbul. It is covered in the deep blues and greens of 16th century Iznik craftsmanship, and in it, if you look long enough, the patterns seem to breathe. She did not stay still either. Not for a single day of her extraordinary life. She came from a village in what is now Ukraine, from a world that had no reason to believe she would ever be anything other than forgotten. She arrived, through no choice of her own, into a world that reduced her to property. And from that place, she built something that spilled forward through the decades and reshaped the relationship between power and gender in one of history's great civilizations. Sleep now. Let the story settle. Let the domes of Istanbul hold it for you. The great dome of the Suleimani and the quieter dome beside it where she rests. Let the Bosphorus carry the sound of water through the night, as it did then, as it does now. She lived a life that burned, and it has not gone out. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories Sleep Dream are released here every day.